Welcome everyone to Arts Alive. It's my pleasure today to welcome James Redfearn, who is an author and who's going to tell us a little bit about books that he's written. Are the three of them in total, Jim, or is it two? Okay. I know a little bit about this one from your having been a guest at Rotary a couple of times. And this is the new one.
Yes.
On the Coyle brothers, which some people in the area may remember them, the infamous Coyle brothers on their run, which brought them into the Plymouth area, or at least. Was it Plymouth?
Middleborough, actually that whole kind of vicinity, the whole area down there.
Good place to hide out, you know, and back in the 50s, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So in those days, it was a lot, wasn't as built up as it is today. And
that's right.
Marshland.
Although that area where the manhunt took place is pretty much the same. It's in the bogs in Middleborough.
Yeah. So. But they found them, and one was shot and one went to jail. Is that how
one
it
was
turned
shot
out?
and died, and the older brother was sentenced to life imprisonment in Pennsylvania, and he died in prison.
And this was for, what was their, what had they done?
They,
for those who may not know.
Yeah, they had committed a series of armed robberies. They decided to take on a life of criminals. I think they got kind of caught up in the romanticism
of it all, right? Yeah.
And because they didn't think they really got a fair shake in life, you know, as far as, you know, economically and whatnot. And so and these guys came from a military background. The older boy, John, was a Air Force second classman down in Florida. And he got hurt in a motorcycle accident and received a medical discharge and came up here and lived with his brother, who was stationed at Otis, the Otis Air Force
at the time,
Base. So they were living, at the time of these events, they were living in Mashney Village. I think they call it Mashney Island now, which is part of like the Buzzards Bay area. And
not too far from Otis.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was close and convenient for them.
Yeah, close and convenient.
Yeah.
So where did they commit the robberies? I mean, how far were they in the area?
Well, believe it or not, the first robbery that they committed was the day after Christmas in 1958, and it was the First National store. You know, if you remember the First National chain.
Yeah, like A&P's.
Yeah,
they went that way. Yeah,
exactly.
Right, yeah.
And they were kind of rambunctious. Every time they went into one of these robberies, if things didn't go exactly the way they wanted, they just started shooting. And they fired a couple of shots in this robbery. In matter of fact, they shot two people. And the reason why they picked the First National store, because at the time that was probably the first chain of grocery stores, you know, the large grocery stores, at least in this area in New England. And
where was that one?
It was in Buzzards Bay.
Oh, okay, so right in their backyard, so to speak.
Yeah, they actually shopped in the store.
So they knew. Right.
They knew the approximate take, so to speak, that the store
would have. Yeah.
And they figured that the day after Christmas, that there'd probably be a pretty good amount of money in the store. Sure. So they robbed that store, and as a result of that robbery, the police did come up with a fingerprint. And so they took off. And the brother, actually, the day after the robbery, reported for duty at the Otis Air Force.
Why not?
Yeah, well, they assumed nobody would know them.
No, exactly, yeah.
So when they
were they masked? Did they go in with a cup? No, nothing.
No.
Wow.
And there's a discussion in there between the brothers about not having a need for a mask, because no one would know who they were, and they kind of thought that this area of Buzzards Bay and that area would be kind of dealing with a bunch of simple folks from the country, and we wouldn't have any problem with them, and the police were very nice.
Everybody was a good soul.
Yeah, so there is a little bit of a kind of a comedy to
the Christmas spirit too.
Yeah, exactly.
Hovering over all of it. Yeah.
So they end up fleeing. About 2 days after the robbery, when they thought that they might be able to identify them with a fingerprint, and they went up to Maine, and eventually made their way to back to where they originally came from, which was Philadelphia. And they committed several more armed robberies, kidnappings, and unfortunately, they were confronted by a young patrolman from the Philadelphia police. Believe it or not, what they were doing, the younger brother, was stealing milk off of the porches. You remember the old milkman used to deliver the bottles of milk?
Yeah.
They were stealing milk, and the police officer had been tipped off by the milkman that somebody's stealing milk, and so he was walking the street and confronted the brother. Unfortunately, the brother got the jump on him and shot him and killed him.
Wow.
And then
Over that.
And they then stole another car with the owner, and that was their modus operandi, as they say. The older brother thought if you steal the car with the owner, then they can't report it stolen. So this poor guy was
Just keep them along.
yeah. This poor guy was just going over to work where they happened to be on strike, and he went over to see what was happening with the strike. And he got out of the car in the parking lot, and they jumped him and made him drive all the way back to Middleborough. And because when they were living in Maston Village, they used to hunt and hike the woods of Middleborough, so they knew the woods very, very well. So they went back to the woods and hid out there for 9 days. And on the 10th day, they decided that they were going to rob a liquor store not far from where they were hiding. And another shot was fired. Fortunately, nobody was hit. And but this time, when they left the robbery of the liquor store, there were two fellas who worked for one of the local cranberry bogs, saw them and thought that they were acting strange, and followed them to that entrance into the woods.
Oh, wow.
And then they reported to the police.
So that was that.
Yeah, well,
The end of the coil, boys.
they ended up having a shootout where there was about 30 rounds expended with a trooper and a Middleborough police officer, a young police officer. And they escaped into the woods and were able to hold off a huge force of over 400 police officers.
Wow.
Looking for them. And it was because they knew the woods and the swamp better than anyone. And it's my humble opinion from reading police reports and whatnot, that it was actually the arrogance of the older brother that got them caught. They were actually they had made their way outside of the perimeter of the police perimeter, and could have, if they kept moving in that direction, which was north, they would have escaped. But in fact, what they did is, he got the bright idea, let's do something that they wouldn't think we'd ever do, and that is to make our way back to where everything began with the shootout and where the command post was. And they were actually across the street trying to steal another car when this young couple who had just moved there, it was the first week they were there, looked out the window and knew what was going on because the police had made such a presence, and saw them outside their car. And they weren't sure what he was doing, but they thought in light of what was going on that they should call the police, and they did. The state police sent a contingent of about 18 officers over there. There was another shootout, about 50 rounds were expended, and one brother was shot and killed, and the other brother, the older brother, was captured.
Was taken. So listen, tell us a little bit about your background and why you both of these stories involve police work, and as they should, given who you are.
Well, I've actually had about 4 careers. I think this might be my 5th. The first career I had was I worked for an industrial commercial photography company. I was an industrial commercial photographer for an electronics company. And this electronics company did a lot of government work, including the timing and firing of nuclear weapons. So we're talking about the very early 60s, 1960, 61, 62. Yeah. And I spent 10 years with them. It was a very fascinating business. But with time, the federal contracts started to dry up, and there were layoffs. I wasn't laid off, but I just thought that the time had come. So long story short, I stayed in that industry for another couple of years, and then I transitioned and went to the state police, probably looking for something a little more secure. And I served 21 years with them and retired as a lieutenant. And then my next career was with a prominent Boston law firm, and I was with them 13 years. And then a short stint with healthcare system. And then I finally retired and been writing. In the meantime, when I was at the law firm, I went back to school.
I remember
and
that. Yeah.
earned a master's degree in creative writing.
From Harvard.
Yes.
No small feat.
No, it was the hardest thing I ever did. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful school, and you know, it just certainly deserves its reputation, I think. So.
Well, they certainly don't give away
they don't give them away, you know,
yeah.
and there's a lot to be said for that.
Right.
A lot to be said for making sure that the people who go through know what they're supposed to know.
Exactly.
When they get out.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about The Rising.
So The Rising
kind
is
of a very different story in many ways from this from the Coyle brothers. And,
right. The Coyle brothers is more. I like to think it's a character study. It also is a snapshot of the 1950s.
50s, yeah.
Which is
this would make a great film, Jim.
Yeah,
really
people
would.
have told me that.
Well, it would. I don't know if you've tried to, you know, promote it to anybody, but this would, I think. I mean, both would.
Right.
But this has really got.
Well, this is. I think this is a little more.
Knock it over here.
I think this is a little more focused and whatnot. It's a smaller story as compared to this.
It is a smaller story, yeah.
And it really does focus on the 1950s, and which were kind of really, I think, a harder time than today. With got the Cold War and the space race and the conflict with Russia and the United States and whatnot, and atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons at the time, and so there was a lot of that. And the police officers that were involved with this case, especially the manhunt, were most likely veterans of either World War II or the Korean conflict.
War,
they probably were children of the Depression and whatnot. So it's.
You could see where it came from.
They were kind of brought up under a lot different conditions than the people today.
Exactly.
So because of that, I think that there's a lot of tension to this, and there's a whole theme through the book about violence and how it affects either the perpetrators or the people who try to right the wrong, so to speak, and how it stays with them, and that really comes out in that story.
Steven Spielberg, you know?
Yeah.
No, send him a copy and a letter. You never know.
You never know.
We have a very well-known writer from this area who actually won an Academy Award for the film L.A. Confidential.
Oh, that's a great movie.
Yeah, it is a great movie.
And that was
Brian Helgeland. He's from New Bedford.
Oh, that's
yes. Parents, if they're still living, they were a few years ago. Still live there, and I mean, you just don't know.
No, you don't.
And he also wrote another great thriller, Mystic. I think he wrote Mystic River.
No, that was Dennis Lehane.
Well, he adapted it then. He must have adapted it because, and perhaps he directed it. I'm not sure, but I'm sure he worked on that film.
Wow.
No,
great.
Chris. What's his name? Directed it.
Oh,
the old Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood
did direct it, but
I
think maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong on that one about Helgeland. But anyway, he's done some good things. Yeah.
So this one here, this is about the Boston police strike of 1919. What's interesting is how I came to writing these two books. The first one was written. The first one I just discussed was written as a result of some observations that I made when I was in the academy myself as a recruit, and I used to pass by the display window all the time, and there was a photograph that really caught my eye. And it was kind of similar to that one you were just talking about.
Coming out of that. Yeah.
And that's what caught my eye on that one. On this one came as a result of a conversation with my father-in-law over a cup of coffee. And he was lamenting that he didn't know his own father because he died when he was 3 years of age. So I decided to see if I could do something for him. I thought it'd be nice to find out something that he didn't know about his father. Because one of the things he told me was that his father had been a Boston police officer. So I ended up doing some research. I met with the archivist from the Boston Police and learned, in fact, he was a Boston police officer, but he was a police officer at a really critical time in not only the department's history, but the city's history. Because he was one of 1,100 patrolmen in 1919 that walked out on strike over working conditions and salary and whatnot. And so as a result of that, that's how I got introduced to that. Now, I grew up in the city. I knew there was such a thing as the Boston police strike, but I didn't know a lot about it. And so I did. I began my research and what I call my discovery stage and began my initial writing. And that's when I learned that this was more than a labor issue. This was more than the labor movement, which was really strong at the time. This really was about a political struggle in Boston over who was going to have political control of the city, between the older established English families,
Right.
otherwise known as the Brahmins, and
The Irish.
the Irish, a newer arrived Irish community.
Yeah.
At the same time, at that very same time as that was going on, there was the Irish Rebellion in Ireland.
Ireland, right.
Which again is a similar theme as the Irish trying to separate themselves from the
Brits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what I did is I combined, so to speak, both stories through my character. And so the story begins in a prologue, 10 years prior to the events of the strike, with our character being involved with something as a teenager that really gives him a thing that he should leave the country.
Ireland.
Ireland.
Right.
And so he does. And when the story opens up in chapter 1, he is now an American citizen. He's a Boston police officer. And this starts the story of the strike. And it's and it's a very interesting time in history. I really enjoyed doing the research on this because there was so much going on. And again, another post-war era,
Right,
and now it's
yeah.
World War I.
Yeah.
The economy was really tough because now the company manufacturing particularly were shifting from a wartime economy to
right.
Yeah. So that all of that, plus now you got the socialist movement, which was very strong at the time, and a lot of the immigrants that were coming from Europe were bringing it with them. And then you had the women's movement,
Right.
the right to vote,
The suffragettes, and right,
prohibition.
Yeah.
All of this was taking place at the exact
that time,
So it was
yeah.
a very turbulent time in
history.
And the guys at the time, men only, that were supposed to keep the lid on all this was the Boston police.
Yeah.
But they had their own issues because they were also at the time, similar to the troopers in the first story, were living in a barrack system. So they spent, in their case, they spent 15 days in the stations before they were allowed to have a day off to go home. And if they wanted to leave the city to take the family to, say, Nantasket or someplace to swim, then they had to get permission from the captain. So it was very strict. But both of these stories
What, about 40, 50 years apart in the time, in their time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so but both these stories, the atmosphere and the police lived in a more of a military type of
Right.
environment than today. And so they were working in really rundown stations. I think the last station had been built around the Civil War. Really poor conditions, really poor salary. And even when they got their day off after 15, that's only if there wasn't a strike. And at the time, this was a real strong labor movement period. And that was a period when workers realized that their greatest weapon was the strike. And so there were a lot of strikes. And in 1919, there were around 3,600 labor strikes in the country.
Wow.
So there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of unrest, a lot of demonstrations. And these were the guys who were trying to keep the lid on the thing. Unfortunately,
Not
like I
getting
said,
paid a lot to do it.
getting paid very little.
Yeah.
I think it was like $1,200 a year. And so they were petitioning both the mayor and the governor for relief for some
Right,
time. And in 1913, they told them that you really need to be paid more and everything, but can you wait until after the war? so they waited till after the war, and after
Nothing
the war,
came.
now the economy is bad,
Yeah.
and they go back to them and they say, no, we don't have the money for you right now, so you have to.
Wow.
And so meantime, they're seeing all these other groups of workers go on strike and get what they want, including the fire department.
I was going to say, I bet the
fire department
the brothers and the
they had gone out 6 months prior to these events in the story, and they got everything they wanted. So these guys, finally, when they couldn't get any resolution from the government, and then the other thing that I need to throw in, the commissioner at the time was a man by the name of Edwin Upton Curtis, and was from the old Brahmin
Yeah,
families.
well, it sounds that
And
way.
there was already an issue between him and the Irish, and the issue was he was elected mayor of the city of Boston in 1895. He was the youngest person ever to be elected mayor. He served 2 years, and when he went to run again, the ward bosses, the Irish ward bosses in the different neighborhoods, rallied against him. And the reason why is because they thought that he was putting most of his resources and most of his efforts into the city proper, and they were getting nothing in the neighborhoods. And so he lost the election. And he never ever
Forgot it?
won. He never forgot it.
Yeah.
He never won another election.
Wow.
As long as he was alive. So he had a kind of a little bit of a grudge against the Irish.
I guess,
at least the ward bosses.
They felt that way, yeah.
Yeah. So at any rate, what happened with these guys was that they petitioned as much as they could, and when they couldn't get any resolution, they had a kind of a fraternity known as like the Social Club, and they ended up using that organization as the start of a union, and they let the commissioner know that if they don't at least get some kind of at least someone to sit down with them about these
Oh,
issues, then they were going to seek a charter with the AFL. And his response was he wasn't happy, obviously, and he said, well, if you do that, then I will fire your union leaders. And of course, the Irish, being the Irish, they said, oh yeah. So at any rate, they did get a charter. He suspended the union leaders, and they threatened to go out on strike unless it was resolved. Now, a number of people tried to resolve it, including the mayor, Andrew Peters, a committee that he set up with James Storrow, as in Storrow Drive.
Storrow,
who was very, very well thought of, highly respected, and he completed a report before they went out on strike, and the commissioner wouldn't even take the time to look at it. Yeah. So unfortunately,
about how many, Jim, were involved in that?
In the strike?
Would you guess? Yeah, in that.
It was about 1,100.
Oh, it's a good number.
Well, that was the most of the patrolmen.
Yeah.
At the time, their association or the union covered up to the rank of sergeant. So sergeant above was considered management.
Right.
So there really only was about 1,100 patrolmen. So the majority of the patrolmen walked off the job on September 9th, 1919. By the way, 100-year anniversary this September.
Amazing, huh?
Yeah.
Well, right, yeah. 2019.
Yeah. So they, unfortunately for the police, what happened was,
and this again, if I'm not mistaken, but there's a big tie-in to the Mission Hill area, right? Is this set in Mission Hill near that Mission Church? And
the picture over there on the board over there is of Station 10, where a lot of the scenes take place. And
would that have been anywhere where that near that? Community college now on that corner there where you take the right and the church is
That's
up
exactly
on the right.
where it was, right about there.
Yeah, I wondered, because it's kind of a central point in that area. Yeah,
it was Station 10, and a lot of the events take place there. And I wrote my characters to live in Mission Hill. Of course, that's my old neighborhood, so I'm kind of giving a little bit of a plug to my neighborhood. So, so a lot of the events take place in the Mission Hill area. Later on with the strikes, there are riots in Roxbury Crossing, but there are also riots in South Boston and Charlestown and East Boston and Boston Central, right in the downtown area. A lot of the merchants' businesses were broken into and property stolen and so forth. Interesting note, talk about the difference in times between now and back then. The larger stores like Jordan Marsh, they had armed men.
They had their own, right?
They hired their own security.
Sure,
stood in the windows with shotguns and whatnot, and they weren't touched.
Come and get us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the riots turned the public sentiment away from them, and
that being the police.
The police. The other point I want to make is that the person who really could have controlled the whole thing and had legal control was the governor, because as I
Who
said,
was?
Calvin Coolidge.
Okay.
Silent Cal.
Yeah.
And he, and the reason why he was the legal authority and the appointing authority for the Commissioner of Police for the city of Boston was because in 1885, the first Irish mayor of Boston was elected. And when the Brahmins and the English saw that, they became nervous because what they saw was an Irish police department, an Irish fire department, and now an Irish mayor. And they really thought, I think, that the Irish were going to take over the city. So they passed a bill, and they controlled the legislature. They passed a bill removing the power of appointment from the mayor of Boston and gave it to the governor.
Wow.
So that at the time of the strike, that becomes important because now Coolidge
controls, who controls the...
Now Coolidge could have done something. He could have. I really believe that the police were agreeable and amenable to sit down and just let's start the process, but the commissioner was such a stiff neck that he just wouldn't deal with them at all. And if you remember Calvin Coolidge, he was kind of that laissez-faire governor, that he just let's let things work their way out.
They'll work themselves out.
Yeah, well they didn't, unfortunately. And he waited until the third day of riots. Then he finally called out the state guard, and that's what finally stopped it and brought things back to normal. Yeah. Meantime, all these 1,100 were fired, and they were blackballed in the city. They weren't allowed.
So that would have included your father-in-law.
That's right.
In that mix.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they weren't allowed to
probably get any other. I was going to say any other type of civil service work. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So it's kind of a tragedy.
Well, again, but a setup too for that time. Like go again. Just before heading into the Depression in some ways, and the Roaring '20s, and all that it was, and that's kind of the focal point and the entranceway in that period, that 1919. Of things that were coming along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ironic thing about all this?
Great history. Great.
It is. It's fabulous
Massachusetts history. I mean, history in general, but certainly Massachusetts history.
Yeah. I really enjoyed doing the research on both books, but particularly this one here, because there was so much to it. And so many, layers upon layers upon layers.
Of stuff.
And ironically, after all was said and done, they replaced these strikers with World War I veterans. And I think that had played into Coolidge's decision, that he knew he had a group of people, a
contingent of people
ready to
roll.
Just came home from World War I. And they took the jobs and they were given everything that the strikers wanted.
Well, isn't that always the way?
Yeah.
But you feel, and you must feel that being the background of both of these stories, you would bring a particular, not only just level of interest as you've talked about, but information that an ordinary writer, let's say, might not have.
Yeah.
Given your police history and knowing the nuances of how things often work.
Yeah. Well,
everywhere, I mean, it doesn't
Well, I think
matter.
particularly because both stories occur in time when both departments were kind of quasi-military organizations, and that's the state
way they
police
were
that I
treated,
remember.
too. Yes,
that's the state police I remember. So, the low pay, the long hours, the living in the barracks, and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think also I was able to think the way a police officer at that time would think.
Well, that's what I mean.
So
That's
forth.
what I mean. You could really put yourself into the situation, whereas somebody else might have to go through third parties to get to that particular place.
Yes.
So, do you have anything in mind for a follow-up to these two?
I don't yet. I'm still. I'm just finishing up. I think most of my promotion now on this one. And I'm thinking maybe the fall, maybe I'll start considering other things.
Yeah.
It would be nice to write a story where both characters, the main characters, somehow or other meet up. And because even though this is 1919, that's 1959, 40 years, but there's still enough.
There could be some connect there.
A grandfather to a grandson,
exactly.
that type of thing.
Well, that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
It's really been a pleasure to have you with us. And once again, I'm Kathy Castro, and I thank the audience for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.